Well, in her memoir, My Land Obsession, Director of Land Reform at Werksmans Attorneys and Presidential Advisor on Land Reform, Bulelwa Mabasa, gives readers a glimpse of how issues of land and land rights have shaped who she is today. Growing up in a four-roomed house in Soweto with her family, Mabasa very early on in life experienced inequality because of the apartheid segragatory laws. She joins us now to tell us more about this. Bulelwa, thank you so much for joining us on this morning's program.
It's my absolute pleasure.
You know, your voice is such a prolific one when it comes to South Africa's land debate. I mean, you've written articles, you've argued before courts, you've spoken quite extensively, and you're privy to the presidential office on matters when it comes to land rights. But this time round, you decided to take on a more personal approach to probably one of the most topical agendas we have today. Why is that? Take us through, the inception of My Land Obsession.
Thank you so much for having me and for the introduction. I think in all the spaces or professional spaces in my professional life that I've occupied, the land question has always been front and center. And I have been privy to, as you've said, to the presidential advisory land panel. I have attended and made submissions in parliament and so forth on land issues. But what I had noticed quite distinctly was that the way that we frame the land question or the land reform discussion in our country lacks a human face and lacks the personal and lacks the empathetic. And I felt that with what I've done in My Land Obsession, my memoir, I try and make the land question belong to each and every citizen. I personalize it, I humanize it, and I trace the genesis and the journey of what then transpired in me choosing it as a life and profession. But I think more than that, and I think this is what is relevant to many people, citizens and so forth, is how the land question must dwell, its reality must dwell in our everyday lives, and that we must find a place and a space for each of us to contribute towards it in its many facets.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the memoir itself a little bit. I mean, you describe for your readers life growing up in Soweto in a four-roomed house and all the sort of socioeconomic challenges that you grew up in and around in that space, in that environment. You also take us through the experiences of your grandparents who firsthand experienced the effects, the ramifications of apartheid-era laws that, dispossessed so many black people in this country. Talk to us about selecting those stories and why those experiences absolutely had to be translated onto the page for our readers.
Thank you so much. So the first, actually, story or anecdote when it comes to land dispossession comes out from a conversation that I was having with my father when I was about 5 years old. And that conversation was sparked by a painting, which was quite a popular painting in many households in Soweto growing up in the 80s. And the inscription has the name Verna, and it's a painting of a black girl, a black child who has a teardrop, dark-skinned with tattered clothes. And for some reason, I was drawn to this painting, and I asked my father why this girl, was crying, why is she in tears? And it was my father's answer to that question that then drew me into this world of landlessness, because my father said to me that the reason that this girl is crying and in a state that she was in the painting is that she is a generation of landless people. And that was the first time that I had this interaction with this concept of dispossession and landlessness. And as I grew up, because I was raised by my grandparents, Elliot and Ceci Kemese, in Zone 4 Meadowlands, they told me a story about the day that the Caspers arrived in Sophia Town, taking all their belongings and forcing them to move out of Sophia Town temporarily into Jabulani and ultimately into Meadowlands. So that also kind of landed to me in very conscious ways, I suppose, in my mind, when I realized that I was a product of this land dispossession, and the curiosity around it never left me until such time that I interacted with a parallel universe of whiteness in urban Johannesburg, when I first was exposed to a netball match that was happening away from the township of Meadowlands into suburbia in Parktown North. And this is when, again, I then have first-hand experience of the dichotomies and the differences and the divisions between dense Soweto overcrowded four-room home with very little infrastructure, and then I get access to urban Parktown with pristine netball matches, pristine, lots of big trees, birds singing, swimming pools and tennis courts. And so that was my first interaction with the effects of landlessness and the land question, which was still something that I was experiencing 2 generations after my grandparents, albeit in a different way. And so all of these kind of stories and anecdotes then lead me to choose law as a profession, because that's why I thought that with law there may be answers, or there may be a voice, or there may be a space for me to occupy and to lend a voice. And lo and behold, when I got to university and I studied law, I actually realized that even within the study of law, the landlessness question was not front and center. We were not studying, in detail the Group Areas Act or the Natives Land Act and so forth. And then ultimately, when I chose to enter the attorney's profession at Werksmans Attorneys, I realized that actually it's not going to be given to me. If I have this insatiable interest in the land question and I try to trace and find ways in which I can bring it to life, it had to be me that had to do it, because it was the thing that was the burning issue for me in my professional life. And so that's what then gave birth to the land reform practice area at Werksmans Attorneys, I would say 16 years ago when I started. So that then, in a roundabout way, answers your question around what led to this memoir. And this memoir for me is important because, as I said, every time that we hear headlines around land reform, it's around whether there's a need for a constitutional amendment. It's around expropriation without compensation, but we're not necessarily dealing with it from its basic terms. We're not educating, we're not saying to the public, right, what is this land reform policy of South Africa? Is it working? How is it comprised of? What are the gaps and where are the opportunities? So in this book, I try and elevate this voice. I try and kind of distill the land question for anyone as if you and I are having a conversation in a coffee shop, because I think it's been very complicated, and it's been treated in a very divisive way, and also in an emotionally detached way. So this is what I try and do in my land obsession.
Right.
To bring it back.
Sure, Bulelwa, I'm so completely taken aback by everything that you've told us. Something that's lingering for me is the descriptor that you use, the world of the landless, is how you led with your answer, and, using descriptors such as, parallel universes of whiteness. And this is certainly the reality that we face as a country. My sense that I'm getting from you is that your hopes for readers who engage with your book is that it will act as some sort of a precursor or an impetus to expose themselves even more to the realities of what it means to be landless in this country. It's almost as if you are encouraging the reader to say, this is my experience, this is my personal experience, but there are so many other experiences similar to mine that can lend a lens to this conversation we have not yet been exposed to. I mean, is that what you're trying to
Absolutely.
To do?
It's a catalyst to having that discussion in a sober way. But most importantly, I speak to landowners, I speak to the landless, I speak to every South African to say this issue does not belong just with the politicians. There are things, and I do make suggestions. I don't want to spoil the book for you, but I do kind of probe that possibility, and that to dare to imagine that you may be part of the solution. You may be someone who is got a position of power in a mine, in a farm, that says, I am putting my hands up and I'm saying, with the excess land that I've got, I want to make land available to those that do not have. I do not have to wait for the state to expropriate me. So it's kind of also speaking to this citizenship and this nation building exercise that I think we must also take charge of as South Africans.
Absolutely. Bulelwa, thank you so much for joining us on our program this morning. What an inspiring conversation. That is Director for Land Reform Rights at Werksmans Attorneys, Bulelwa Mabasa, joining us there.